It's 1200 BCE. The Mediterranean is the center of the most sophisticated civilization humanity has ever known. Massive stone palaces rise from Greek hilltops. Egyptian pharaohs rule from golden thrones. Hittite armies march across Anatolia in bronze armor that gleams like fire. Trade ships carry precious goods between dozens of thriving cities. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia. An interconnected world where cultures separated by thousands of miles share the same luxury goods, the same technologies, the same dreams of empire. Then, in the span of 50 years, it all collapses. Palaces burn. Cities are abandoned. Trade routes go silent. Writing systems are forgotten so completely that it takes archaeologists 3,000 years to remember how to read them. The Bronze Age civilizations don't just decline. They vanish. 12 major civilizations, from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Anatolia to the Levant, simply cease to exist. The greatest international system in human history disintegrates so completely that survivors forget what the world was like before. What caused this collapse? War? Climate change? Economic crisis? Plague? Natural disaster? Internal revolution? The answer is all of them, and none of them. Because the Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by a single catastrophe. It was a cascade of interconnected failures that brought down the most advanced civilization the ancient world had ever seen. Tonight, we journey back to humanity's first global catastrophe, the collapse that ended the Bronze Age and plunged the Mediterranean into centuries of darkness. The systemic failure that shows us how even the most powerful civilizations can crumble when the wrong pressures align at the wrong time. This is the story of the late Bronze Age collapse, the first time human civilization almost ended, and the terrifying preview of how our own interconnected world might someday fall. To understand the magnitude of the Bronze Age collapse, you first need to understand the glory of what was lost. The late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE, represents the first truly international civilization in human history. This wasn't just a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was an interconnected world system that spanned 3 continents. A network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that created the most sophisticated society humanity had yet achieved. At the center of this world sat Egypt, the superpower of the ancient Mediterranean. The new kingdom pharaohs ruled from magnificent capitals adorned with gold and precious stones. The wealth of Egypt was legendary even in ancient times. Golden burial masks, temples covered in electrum, treasuries filled with exotic goods from across the known world. But Egyptian wealth came from more than just the fertile Nile. Egypt was the hub of an international trade network that stretched from Britain to India. Egyptian gold was traded for Cypriot copper, Afghan lapis lazuli, and Baltic amber. Egyptian luxury goods flowed to every corner of the ancient world. To the north, the Hittite Empire controlled the plateau of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Hittites were master metalworkers who had perfected the art of iron production, while the rest of the world still relied on bronze. Their armies were equipped with superior weapons and drawn by horsepower chariots that could crush traditional infantry. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Massive stone walls protected an urban center that housed over 40,000 people. Royal archives contained thousands of clay tablets recording diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and international treaties. Further north, the Mycenaean Greeks controlled a confederation of palace-states across southern Greece and the Aegean Islands. These weren't the classical Greeks of Athens and Sparta, but their Bronze Age ancestors who built the massive stone palaces at Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae itself. Mycenaean society was organized around powerful warrior kings who lived in palaces that dominated the surrounding countryside. These palaces weren't just royal residences. They were administrative centers that controlled every aspect of economic life. Scribes using the linear B writing system recorded everything from tax collection to livestock inventories to religious offerings. The Mycenaeans were master sailors and traders. Their pottery has been found from Sicily to the Black Sea, evidence of trade networks that span the entire Mediterranean. They established trading posts and colonies throughout the Aegean, creating the first Greek commercial empire. To the east, the Assyrian Empire was emerging as a major power in Mesopotamia. Assyrian merchants had established trading networks that stretched from Iran to Anatolia. Their records, preserved in the archives at Kanesh, reveal a sophisticated commercial system with standardized contracts, banking arrangements, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Smaller powers filled the gaps between these great empires. The Babylonians controlled southern Mesopotamia from their ancient capital. The Kassites ruled from the mountains of Iran. Canaanite city-states like Ugarit served as crucial intermediaries in international trade. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Late Bronze Age was the diplomatic system that connected these diverse civilizations. Royal correspondence preserved in Egyptian and Hittite archives reveals a world of constant communication between rulers separated by thousands of miles. Pharaohs and kings exchanged gifts, negotiated marriages, and coordinated military campaigns. They wrote to each other as equals, using diplomatic protocols that wouldn't look out of place in a modern embassy. International law governed trade disputes, territorial conflicts, and succession crises. The Amarna letters, discovered in the archive of Pharaoh Akhenaten, contain correspondence between Egypt and kingdoms across the Near East. These letters reveal a world where Babylonian princesses married Egyptian princes, where Hittite gold was traded for Egyptian grain, where military assistance was provided across thousands of miles of territory. This international system was held together by more than just trade and diplomacy. It was unified by shared technologies, artistic styles, and cultural practices. Bronze working techniques spread from Anatolia to Egypt. Artistic motifs traveled from Mesopotamia to Greece. Religious concepts crossed cultural boundaries with remarkable ease. The result was a civilization of unprecedented sophistication and complexity. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands. International trade networks that moved goods across 3 continents. Technologies that wouldn't be surpassed for over a millennium. But this sophisticated system had a fatal weakness. It was so interconnected that local failures could cascade into regional catastrophes. When the Bronze Age world finally collapsed, it collapsed everywhere at once. The Golden Age was about to end, and when it ended, it would take centuries for civilization to recover from the loss. The collapse of the Bronze Age world didn't happen overnight. It began with subtle signs of stress that appeared decades before the final catastrophe. Small problems that cascaded into larger failures. Local disruptions that spread through the interconnected network until the entire system began to break down. The first major crack appeared in the north, in the Hittite heartland of Anatolia. Throughout the 13th century BCE, Hittite records began documenting increasing problems with northern neighbors. Attacks by groups they called the Kaska, rebellions in peripheral territories, disruptions to trade routes that connected Anatolia to the broader international system. These weren't just military problems. They were symptoms of deeper stresses affecting the entire Hittite system. Climate data from the period shows evidence of cooling temperatures and reduced rainfall across Anatolia. Agricultural yields declined. Pastoralist groups who had previously lived peacefully on the empire's borders began raiding settled territories in search of resources. The Hittite Empire tried to respond to these challenges through traditional means. Military campaigns against rebellious provinces. Diplomatic negotiations with threatening neighbors. Infrastructure projects designed to improve agricultural productivity. But these solutions required resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. Military campaigns were expensive. Infrastructure projects required massive labor investments. Diplomatic gifts strained royal treasuries. Each response to the crisis created new problems that required additional resources to solve. Meanwhile, similar stresses were appearing throughout the Bronze Age world. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III describe increasing attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who attacked Egyptian territory from the Mediterranean. These Sea Peoples weren't a single coherent group. They appear to have been refugees, displaced populations, and opportunistic raiders from across the eastern Mediterranean. Some may have been Mycenaean Greeks driven from their homes by local conflicts. Others might have been Anatolian peoples fleeing the collapse of Hittite authority. The important point is that they existed at all. In a stable Bronze Age world, such large-scale population movements wouldn't have been necessary or possible. The fact that thousands of people were abandoning their homes and taking to the sea suggests that something fundamental was going wrong with the international system. In Greece, Mycenaean palace records from the final century of the Bronze Age show increasing militarization and defensive preparations. Walls were strengthened, watchtowers were built, military equipment was stockpiled. The Linear B tablets from Pylos describe urgent preparations for coastal defense against seaborne attackers. These defensive measures suggest that Mycenaean rulers were aware of growing threats to their power. But they also reveal the limitations of Bronze Age military technology and organization. Mycenaean armies were designed for offensive campaigns and territorial conquest, not for defending scattered coastal settlements against mobile raiders. Trade records from the period show another troubling trend. The long-distance trade networks that had connected the Bronze Age world were becoming increasingly unreliable. Ships failed to arrive at their destinations. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were abandoned. Exotic goods became scarce in places where they had previously been common. The disruption of trade had cascading effects throughout the international system. Cities that depended on imported raw materials couldn't maintain their manufacturing industries. Regions that specialized in producing goods for export lost their primary source of wealth. The sophisticated division of labor that had made Bronze Age civilization possible began to break down. Archaeological evidence suggests that even successful regions were struggling with internal problems. At Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities of the late Bronze Age, excavations have revealed evidence of hasty repairs to the city's fortifications, emergency food storage, and desperate attempts to maintain diplomatic relations with distant allies. A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, found in the ruins of the city's palace, provides a haunting glimpse of the crisis. My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done evil to the land. Does my father not know that all my infantry and chariots are in the Hittite land, and that all my ships are in Lycia? They have not yet returned, and the land is left to itself. This letter reveals the dilemma facing late Bronze Age rulers. The international system required them to commit military resources to support distant allies and maintain trade relationships. But these commitments left their home territories vulnerable to local threats that were becoming increasingly common. The first cracks in the Bronze Age world revealed a fundamental problem with highly interconnected systems. Success depended on everything working correctly. When multiple components began failing simultaneously, the entire network became unstable. Local problems that might have been manageable in isolation became regional catastrophes when combined with failures elsewhere. The sophisticated international system that had created Bronze Age prosperity became a mechanism for spreading crisis and collapse across the entire Mediterranean world. The Golden Age was ending, but few contemporaries realized how complete the coming collapse would be. In the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, no group is more mysterious or more terrifying than the Sea Peoples. These maritime raiders appear in Egyptian records like a force of nature, destroying everything in their path and vanishing back into the Mediterranean mists. But who were they? Where did they come from? And how did relatively small groups of seaborne raiders manage to contribute to the collapse of the entire Bronze Age world? The term Sea Peoples comes from Egyptian inscriptions that describe attacks by groups who came from the sea. But this wasn't a single unified force. Egyptian records mention dozens of different groups with names like the Peleset, the Cheker, the Shikalesh, and the Denyen. Some of these names are recognizable. The Peleset are probably the Philistines, who later settled in coastal Palestine. The Shikalesh might be the Sicilians. The Denyen could be the Greeks mentioned in Homer's epics as the Danaans. This suggests that the Sea Peoples weren't barbarian invaders from beyond the civilized world. They were refugees, displaced populations, and opportunistic raiders from within the Bronze Age system itself. People who had been part of the international civilization but had been driven to desperate measures by its collapse. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III left detailed records of his battles against the Sea Peoples around 1180 BCE. His inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe massive naval and land battles that supposedly saved Egypt from invasion. But these records also reveal something troubling about the nature of the threat. The Sea Peoples weren't just raiders looking for quick plunder. They were entire populations on the move. Men, women, children, and livestock traveling in ox carts and ships, looking for new homes. This wasn't military conquest in the traditional sense. It was mass migration driven by desperation. The scale of these movements was unprecedented in the ancient world. Conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people were displaced during the Bronze Age collapse. That's a demographic catastrophe on par with the Great Migrations that ended the Roman Empire. But unlike the barbarian invasions of Rome, the Sea People's movements seem to have been caused by the collapse of civilization rather than being the cause of that collapse. These weren't external enemies attacking a stable system. They were products of a system that was already falling apart. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Sea Peoples groups originated from regions that were experiencing their own collapses. Pottery styles, weapon types, and burial practices link different Sea Peoples groups to specific regions of the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. This creates a complex picture of cascading failures. Local collapses in Greece forced populations to migrate, putting pressure on Anatolian territories. Anatolian instability displaced additional populations, who then put pressure on Levantine cities. Each wave of migration created new instabilities that generated additional waves of displacement. The Sea Peoples were both symptom and cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were created by the failure of the international system, but their movements accelerated that failure by spreading instability across the entire Mediterranean. Modern analysis of Sea Peoples raids reveals sophisticated military organization that suggests these weren't simply desperate refugees. They used coordinated land and sea attacks. They employed advanced siege techniques. They adapted quickly to local conditions and defensive measures. This military sophistication probably came from their origins within the Bronze Age world. Many Sea Peoples groups likely included professional soldiers, displaced palace guards, and experienced Marines who brought advanced military knowledge to their new roles as raiders. The Sea Peoples also possessed advanced maritime technology that allowed them to operate across the entire Mediterranean. Their ships were fast enough to outrun pursuit, maneuverable enough to attack coastal settlements, and large enough to transport entire populations across hundreds of miles of open water. But perhaps the most important aspect of the Sea Peoples phenomenon was its psychological impact on Bronze Age civilization. For centuries, the international system had provided security through diplomatic agreements, trade relationships, and mutual defense pacts. The Sea Peoples represented the complete breakdown of this security system. Traditional Bronze Age armies were designed to fight other Bronze Age armies in conventional battles. They weren't equipped to deal with mobile raiders who struck without warning and disappeared before effective retaliation could be organized. The psychological effect of this new kind of warfare was devastating. Cities that had never needed serious fortifications suddenly found themselves building massive defensive walls. Trade routes that had operated safely for generations were abandoned. International agreements became worthless when no one could guarantee the security of their own territories. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy cities and trade networks. They destroyed confidence in the entire Bronze Age way of life. They proved that the sophisticated international system that had created unprecedented prosperity could also create unprecedented vulnerability. In the end, the Sea Peoples mystery reflects the larger mystery of the Bronze Age collapse itself. They were both effect and cause, symptom and disease, victim and perpetrator. They embodied the complex, interconnected nature of the crisis that brought down the ancient world's first global civilization. Hidden beneath the political and military chaos of the Bronze Age collapse lies an environmental crisis that may have triggered the entire catastrophe. Modern climate science has revealed that the collapse coincided with one of the most severe climate changes in recorded human history. The Late Bronze Age had been a period of remarkable climate stability. For over 400 years, the Mediterranean had experienced warm temperatures, reliable rainfall, and predictable seasonal patterns. This climate stability was one of the foundations of Bronze Age prosperity. Stable climate meant reliable agricultural yields. Reliable agriculture meant population growth. Population growth meant larger armies, more artisans, and more extensive trade networks. The entire Bronze Age system was built on the assumption that environmental conditions would remain favorable. But around 1200 BCE, that assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Paleoclimate data from ice cores, tree rings, and lake sediments reveals that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a sudden and severe cooling around 1200 BCE. Temperatures dropped by several degrees. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. The reliable climate that had supported Bronze Age civilization for centuries disappeared in the span of a few decades. This wasn't just a temporary drought or a bad harvest season. It was a fundamental shift in regional climate patterns that lasted for over a century. The archaeological record shows evidence of abandoned settlements, reduced population levels, and economic collapse across the entire region affected by the climate change. The climate crisis hit different regions at different times and with varying severity. Anatolia, the heartland of the Hittite Empire, appears to have been affected first and most severely. Pollen analysis and lake-level data show evidence of severe drought beginning around 1250 BCE. The Hittite Empire had always been vulnerable to climate variation. Unlike Egypt, which had the reliable flood cycles of the Nile, Anatolia depended on rainfall agriculture. When the rains failed, the entire economic foundation of Hittite civilization was threatened. Hittite records from the final century of the empire document desperate efforts to deal with agricultural crisis. Grain was imported from Egypt. New settlements were established in more favorable agricultural areas. Tax systems were modified to account for reduced productivity. But these adaptive measures required resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. Importing grain was expensive. Establishing new settlements required military protection in an increasingly unstable world. Modifying tax systems reduced government revenues at precisely the time when more resources were needed to deal with the crisis. The climate crisis spread south and west as atmospheric patterns shifted across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Greece experienced severe drought beginning around 1225 BCE. Archaeological evidence shows that many Mycenaean settlements were abandoned during this period, with populations concentrating in more defensible locations with reliable water sources. The palace system that had dominated Mycenaean civilization was particularly vulnerable to climate stress. These administrative centers controlled agricultural production across large territories through complex redistribution systems. When agricultural yields declined, the entire system became unsustainable. Linear B tablets from the final years of Mycenaean civilization document increasing problems with tax collection, military recruitment, and food distribution. The sophisticated bureaucratic system that had managed Bronze Age prosperity couldn't adapt quickly enough to manage Bronze Age crisis. The Levantine coast, home to crucial trading cities like Ugarit and Byblos, experienced its own version of the climate catastrophe. Reduced rainfall affected agricultural productivity, but perhaps more importantly, it affected the highland regions that supplied these coastal cities with pastoral products and raw materials. Highland populations that could no longer support themselves through traditional agriculture and pastoralism began migrating toward coastal areas. This put additional pressure on urban food supplies while simultaneously disrupting the trade networks that connected coastal cities to their inland suppliers. But the climate crisis affected more than just agriculture. It fundamentally altered the environmental conditions that had made Bronze Age civilization possible. Rivers that had been navigable for centuries became too shallow for large vessels. Harbors that had served as international trading centers silted up as changing precipitation patterns altered erosion rates. Even more troubling, the climate crisis appears to have triggered social and political instabilities that accelerated the collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Bronze Age societies experienced internal conflicts during the climate crisis period. Elite tombs show evidence of violent destruction. Palace complexes were burned or abandoned. This pattern suggests that climate stress didn't just cause economic problems. It caused political revolutions that overthrew the ruling classes who were blamed for failing to maintain prosperity. The sophisticated international system that had connected Bronze Age civilizations depended on political stability that evaporated when environmental conditions deteriorated. Modern climate modeling suggests that the Bronze Age climate crisis was caused by shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns that affected the entire northern hemisphere. Similar climate changes have been linked to social instability and political collapse in other historical periods. The Bronze Age collapse provides a sobering case study in how climate change can interact with social, economic, and political systems to create cascading failures. The climate crisis alone might not have been enough to destroy Bronze Age civilization, but when combined with other stresses, it created conditions that made collapse almost inevitable. The environmental foundation of the Bronze Age world had shifted beneath its feet, and when that foundation cracked, everything built on top of it came crashing down. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the failure of individual civilizations. It was the catastrophic breakdown of the world's first global system, a network of interconnected dependencies that had created unprecedented prosperity, but also unprecedented vulnerability. To understand how this system failed, imagine the Bronze Age world as a vast machine with thousands of moving parts. Trade routes were the belts and gears. Cities were the engines. Kingdoms were the power sources. For centuries, this machine had run smoothly, generating wealth and technological progress across 3 continents. But machines can fail in 2 ways. Individual components can break, or the connections between components can fail. The Bronze Age collapse was primarily a connectivity failure. The links between civilizations broke down faster than the civilizations themselves. The backbone of the Bronze Age system was long-distance trade. But Bronze Age trade wasn't just about moving luxury goods between wealthy elites. It was about moving essential raw materials that entire civilizations depended on for their survival. Cyprus provided copper. Afghanistan provided tin. Combining these metals created bronze, the alloy that gave the era its name. But most Bronze Age civilizations had access to only one of these essential materials. They depended on international trade to obtain the other. When trade routes were disrupted, entire technological systems collapsed. Cities that had specialized in bronze working suddenly couldn't obtain the raw materials they needed. Military units equipped with bronze weapons found themselves unable to maintain their equipment. The technological advantage that had enabled Bronze Age armies to dominate less sophisticated neighbors evaporated. The interdependence went far beyond metallurgy. Egypt exported grain to feed the populations of less agriculturally favored regions. Anatolia exported livestock and pastoral products. The Levantine coast provided crucial intermediary services that connected producers with consumers across vast distances. Each region had developed specialized economic roles within the broader international system. This specialization increased efficiency and generated wealth, but it also created vulnerabilities that became apparent when the system began to break down. When Egyptian grain shipments stopped arriving in Anatolia, Hittite cities faced famine. When Anatolian pastoral products stopped reaching the Levantine coast, urban populations lost access to essential protein sources. When Levantine intermediary services collapsed, producers and consumers across the Mediterranean lost access to international markets. The failure of trade networks had cascading effects that spread far beyond economics. Bronze Age governments depended on trade revenues to fund their military forces, administrative systems, and construction projects. When trade revenues declined, governments lost the resources they needed to maintain order and provide public services. Political instability further disrupted trade networks, creating a vicious cycle of economic and political collapse. Merchants stopped traveling to regions where they couldn't be guaranteed safe passage. International agreements became worthless when no one could enforce them. The diplomatic system that had managed conflicts and maintained stability for centuries simply ceased to function. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the system's failure was the collapse of information networks. Bronze Age civilizations had developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed rulers to coordinate policies across vast distances. Royal messengers carried diplomatic correspondence between capitals separated by thousands of miles. When political authority collapsed in key regions, these communication networks broke down. Rulers lost the ability to coordinate responses to regional crises. Local problems that might have been manageable with international cooperation became regional catastrophes when cooperation became impossible. The breakdown of information networks also meant that technological knowledge stopped spreading between regions. Bronze Age civilization had advanced through the constant exchange of innovations between different cultures. When that exchange stopped, Technological progress not only halted but actually reversed as local communities lost access to knowledge they couldn't maintain independently. Writing systems that had been used for international communication were abandoned when there was no longer anyone to communicate with. The sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had managed Bronze Age economies collapsed when the economies they managed ceased to exist. Modern network theory suggests that the Bronze Age system had become too complex for its own stability. The more interconnected the system became, the more vulnerable it was to cascade failures. What started as local disruptions in peripheral regions spread through the network until they brought down the entire system. This pattern of systemic failure has disturbing parallels to modern global systems. Today's world economy is far more interconnected than the Bronze Age world ever was. Modern supply chains span the globe. Critical technologies depend on materials and components sourced from dozens of countries. Financial systems link markets across continents in real time. These connections create enormous efficiencies and enable unprecedented prosperity. But they also create vulnerabilities that didn't exist in simpler, more localized systems. When critical nodes fail, the effects can spread globally within hours or days. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that complexity itself can become a source of vulnerability. Systems that appear robust during stable periods can collapse with shocking speed when multiple stresses align. The very interconnections that create prosperity during good times can become vectors for spreading crisis during bad times. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't that complex systems are necessarily doomed to fail. It's that they require active management and redundancy to prevent local failures from becoming global catastrophes. The Bronze Age world lacked the institutional mechanisms needed to manage systemic risk. When the system finally collapsed, it collapsed everywhere at once. And it would take centuries for anything approaching its sophistication to emerge again. Hidden beneath the obvious chaos of climate change and foreign invasion lies a darker story of the Bronze Age collapse. In palace after palace across the Mediterranean world, archaeological evidence suggests that the final blow to Bronze Age civilization came not from external enemies, but from internal betrayal. The great palaces of the late Bronze Age weren't just royal residences. They were the nerve centers of entire civilizations. Administrative headquarters that controlled trade, agriculture, military forces, and religious activities across vast territories. The palace systems of Egypt, Anatolia, and Greece represented the most sophisticated governmental structures the ancient world had yet achieved. But these palace systems had a fatal weakness. They concentrated enormous power in the hands of small elite groups while creating vast disparities between rulers and subjects. As the Bronze Age world faced increasing external pressures, these internal tensions reached a breaking point. The archaeological evidence for internal collapse is compelling and disturbing. At site after site across the Bronze Age world, excavations reveal that palaces and administrative centers were destroyed not by foreign armies, but by carefully planned internal attacks. At Pylos, the great Mycenaean palace that controlled southwestern Greece, archaeologists found evidence of systematic destruction that could only have been carried out by people intimately familiar with the palace's layout and defenses. Archive rooms were specifically targeted. Administrative records were deliberately destroyed. Treasury areas were selectively looted. This wasn't the random destruction typical of foreign invasion. It was the precise elimination of governmental infrastructure by people who understood exactly how the system worked and what needed to be destroyed to bring it down permanently. Similar patterns appear at palace sites throughout the Mycenaean world. At Tiryns, massive fortification walls that could have withstood any external siege were breached from within. At Mycenae itself, the citadel that gave its name to an entire civilization shows evidence of internal destruction that specifically targeted administrative and religious centers. The Linear B tablets that preserve the final records of Mycenaean civilization provide tantalizing glimpses of the internal tensions that led to these palace conspiracies. Records from Pylos document increasing problems with tax collection, military recruitment, and local resistance to palace authority. One series of tablets describes urgent efforts to reorganize coastal defenses, but the proposed measures required resources and manpower that local communities were apparently unwilling to provide. Another series documents attempts to collect emergency taxes from religious sanctuaries, suggesting that normal revenue sources had been exhausted. These records paint a picture of governments losing control over their own populations. Palace administrators were demanding sacrifices to deal with external threats, but their subjects were no longer willing to bear the costs of maintaining systems that primarily benefited elite groups. The same pattern appears in Hittite records from the final decades of the empire. Royal archives document increasing problems with local governors who refused to implement imperial policies, provincial administrators who embezzled tax revenues, military commanders who ignored orders from the capital. By the reign of the last Hittite king, Subsribe II, the central government had lost effective control over much of its territory. Provincial governors were acting as independent rulers. Local communities were making their own diplomatic arrangements with foreign powers. The empire existed in name only. When the final collapse came, it appears to have been triggered not by external invasion, but by coordinated rebellion across multiple provinces. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Hittite capital of Hattusa was destroyed by forces that included local populations who had detailed knowledge of the city's defenses and administrative systems. The Egyptian evidence is more complex because Egypt ultimately survived the Bronze Age collapse, but even there, records from the reign of Ramesses III document serious internal problems. Tomb inscriptions describe workers' strikes, administrative corruption, and plots against royal authority. The famous papyrus records from Deir el-Medina reveal a community of royal tomb builders who went on strike because they hadn't been paid for months. Government workers in the heart of the Egyptian state were refusing to work because the administrative system had broken down. More seriously, papyrus records describe assassination plots against Ramesses III involving high-ranking court officials. The fact that such plots reached the highest levels of government suggests that even Egypt's seemingly stable political system was experiencing severe internal stress. Modern analysis of these palace conspiracies reveals a pattern that has disturbing parallels to other historical collapses. When external pressures increase, governments typically respond by demanding greater sacrifices from their populations. But if those governments lack legitimacy, or if the benefits of their rule are unequally distributed, external pressure can trigger internal revolution. The Bronze Age palace systems had become increasingly disconnected from the populations they ruled. Elite groups lived in luxury, while common people bore the costs of maintaining expensive international commitments. Palace administrators controlled vast resources, while rural communities struggled with declining agricultural productivity. When external threats required even greater sacrifices, these internal tensions exploded into open rebellion. Local communities that had once supported palace authority turned against it. Provincial administrators who had once carried out royal policies began pursuing their own interests. Military forces that had once protected the palaces began attacking them. The palace conspiracies of the Bronze Age collapse demonstrate that political systems can become their own worst enemies. The very concentration of power that makes governments effective during stable periods can make them targets for revolution during crisis periods. Internal betrayal completed the destruction that external pressures had begun. When the palace systems collapsed, they took with them not just political authority, but the entire administrative infrastructure that had made Bronze Age civilization possible. The conspirators who brought down the palaces thought they were solving their immediate problems. What they actually did was eliminate the only institutions capable of managing the complex systems that their own prosperity depended on. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is usually told through the lens of great powers and famous cities. The fall of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Mycenaean palaces, the attacks on Egyptian territory. But this focus on major civilizations obscures the fate of countless smaller communities that were swept away by the collapse. For every great palace that was destroyed, dozens of smaller settlements simply vanished from the archaeological record. Villages, trading posts, and regional centers that had thrived for centuries were abandoned so completely that archaeologists struggle to find traces of their existence. These forgotten victims of the Bronze Age collapse represent a human tragedy on an almost incomprehensible scale. Modern demographic estimates suggest that the population of the Eastern Mediterranean declined by as much as 50 during the collapse period. That means millions of people died, fled, or simply disappeared during the catastrophe. The small island of Cyprus provides one of the clearest examples of what happened to these forgotten communities. Cyprus had been one of the most prosperous regions of the Bronze Age world. Its copper mines supplied the entire Mediterranean with the raw materials needed for bronze production. Its cities were wealthy international trading centers that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe. Archaeological surveys of Cyprus reveal that the island supported over 200 settlements during the Late Bronze Age. These range from major urban centers like Nkomi to small agricultural villages scattered across the island's interior. The island's population may have reached 100,000 people at its peak, but by 1150 BCE, most of these settlements had been abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests that many were destroyed by violence, while others were simply left empty as their populations fled to unknown destinations. By the end of the collapse period, Cyprus supported fewer than 20 significant settlements. What happened to the other 180 communities? What happened to the 80,000 people who vanished from the archaeological record? The answer is that we simply don't know. They became refugees, casualties, or slaves in events that were too chaotic and too widespread to be recorded by any surviving historical source. The same pattern appears throughout the eastern Mediterranean. In the Aegean Islands, surveys reveal hundreds of Bronze Age settlements that were abandoned during the collapse period. Many show evidence of hasty departure. Pottery was left on tables. Tools were scattered on workshop floors. Valuable items were hidden in caches that were never retrieved. These details paint a picture of communities that were forced to flee with little warning. Families that had lived in the same locations for generations suddenly had to abandon everything they had built. The stable, predictable life that Bronze Age civilization had provided for ordinary people evaporated overnight. The human cost of this displacement was enormous. Bronze Age communities were closely adapted to local environmental conditions. They knew which crops grew best in their specific soils. They understood the seasonal patterns that governed agriculture and fishing. They had social networks that provided support during difficult times. When these communities were forced to flee, they lost more than just their homes. They lost the accumulated knowledge that had allowed them to thrive in their specific environments. They lost the social connections that had provided security and identity. They became refugees in a world where traditional sources of help and support had also collapsed. Archaeological evidence suggests that many displaced populations attempted to establish new communities in previously uninhabited areas. Hilltop settlements appear throughout the Mediterranean during the collapse period, often in locations that were defensible but poorly suited for agriculture. These refuge communities struggled to survive in harsh environments without the resources and knowledge they had accumulated in their original homes. Many of these settlements show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and early abandonment. People who had once lived comfortable lives were reduced to subsistence existence in marginal environments. The collapse also created massive flows of refugees that overwhelmed the capacity of surviving communities to provide assistance. Egyptian records describe waves of displaced populations seeking shelter in Egyptian territory. But Egypt was struggling with its own problems and couldn't absorb large numbers of refugees without creating additional internal pressures. The forgotten victims of the Bronze Age collapse remind us that behind every historical catastrophe lie countless individual tragedies. Families torn apart, communities destroyed, lives reduced from comfort to desperation in a matter of months or years. These human stories don't appear in royal inscriptions or palace archives, but they represent the true cost of civilizational collapse. Modern refugee crises provide sobering parallels to the displacement that occurred during the Bronze Age collapse. When stable societies break down, the most vulnerable populations suffer the most. The wealthy and powerful often have resources and connections that allow them to escape or adapt to changing conditions. Ordinary people are left to face the consequences with whatever they can carry. The Bronze Age collapse created a lost generation of refugees who never found new homes, displaced populations who died in unfamiliar territories, and communities that simply vanished from history without leaving any record of their final fate. These forgotten victims remind us that civilizational collapse isn't just an abstract historical process. It's a human catastrophe that destroys millions of individual lives. When the Bronze Age world finally collapsed, it didn't just end a civilization. It erased the memory of what civilization could be. The centuries that followed the collapse represent one of the darkest periods in human history, a time when the survivors forgot almost everything their ancestors had achieved. This period, roughly 1150 to 800 BCE, is often called the Greek Dark Ages, but that name understates the scope of the catastrophe. The darkness wasn't limited to Greece. It covered the entire eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia to Egypt, from Cyprus to the Levant. Archaeological evidence reveals the magnitude of what was lost. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people were reduced to villages of a few hundred inhabitants. Monumental architecture disappeared. Artistic traditions that had flourished for centuries were abandoned. Technologies that had taken generations to develop were forgotten. But perhaps the most devastating loss was literacy itself. The writing systems that had recorded Bronze Age history, literature, law, and science simply vanished. Linear B, the script used to administer Mycenaean palaces, was forgotten so completely that it took modern scholars over 50 years to decipher it. Hittite cuneiform disappeared along with the empire that had used it. Even in regions where writing survived, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, literacy became restricted to tiny elite groups. The loss of literacy meant the loss of accumulated knowledge. Legal systems that had governed international relations for centuries vanished without a trace. Scientific observations that had guided agriculture and navigation were forgotten. Religious and philosophical traditions that had shaped Bronze Age culture disappeared. Literary works that had entertained and educated generations of readers were lost forever. Trade networks that had connected 3 continents contracted to local exchanges between neighboring communities. Technologies that had spread across the ancient world became isolated regional practices. The sophisticated metallurgy that had created bronze weapons and tools gave way to simpler ironworking techniques that produced inferior but more easily manufactured products. Even basic crafts declined in quality and sophistication. Pottery from the Dark Age period is crude and simple compared to the elegant vessels produced during the Bronze Age. Architecture became purely functional, with no decoration or artistic elaboration. Artistic traditions that had flourished for centuries disappeared entirely. Population levels plummeted throughout the affected regions. Surveys in Greece suggest that the population may have declined by as much as 90 in some areas. Entire regions that had been densely settled during the Bronze Age became virtually uninhabited. The demographic catastrophe was so severe that it took centuries for population levels to recover. But the collapse wasn't uniform across all regions. Some areas adapted better than others to the new conditions. Egypt survived as a centralized state, though much weakened and isolated from its former international connections. Mesopotamia maintained some continuity in its urban traditions, though trade networks and technological development stagnated. The most successful adaptations occurred in regions that had been peripheral to the Bronze Age system. Groups that had been considered barbarian by Bronze Age standards found themselves inheriting a world where traditional advantages no longer mattered. Ironworking peoples who had been excluded from the bronze-based international system suddenly found their technology more practical and accessible than bronze. These peripheral groups often preserved elements of Bronze Age culture that disappeared in the former heartlands of civilization. Oral traditions that would later be recorded as Homer's epics may have preserved memories of Mycenaean Greece. Cultural practices that vanished from palace centers survived in rural communities that had been less affected by the collapse. The Dark Age wasn't completely without innovation. Iron metallurgy, though initially inferior to bronze working, eventually proved superior for producing everyday tools and weapons. New agricultural techniques adapted to post-collapse conditions. Regional trade networks, though much smaller than their Bronze Age predecessors, provided the foundation for eventual recovery. But progress was slow and uneven. It took centuries for any region to approach the population levels, technological sophistication, or international connections that had characterized the Bronze Age world. The recovery, when it finally came, would create new forms of civilization rather than simply restoring what had been lost. The alphabet, developed by Phoenician traders during the Dark Age, would eventually prove more flexible and accessible than the complex writing systems of the Bronze Age. The city-state system that emerged in Greece would create new forms of political organization. The iron-working techniques that replaced bronze metallurgy would prove more sustainable and egalitarian. But these innovations came at an enormous cost. Centuries of human development were lost. Generations of people lived in poverty and ignorance because the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors had vanished. The Bronze Age collapse represents one of the greatest setbacks in human history, a catastrophe so complete that civilization had to essentially start over from scratch. The darkness that followed the Bronze Age collapse reminds us how fragile human progress really is. Knowledge that seems permanent can be lost. Technologies that appear essential can be forgotten. Civilizations that seem invincible can collapse so completely that later generations forget they ever existed. The Bronze Age collapse happened over 3,000 years ago, but its lessons remain disturbingly relevant to our modern interconnected world. In many ways, today's global civilization shares the same vulnerabilities that brought down the Bronze Age system, only on a much larger scale. Like the Bronze Age world, modern civilization depends on complex networks of international trade and cooperation. Critical resources are concentrated in specific regions and must be transported across vast distances to reach consumers. Specialized economies depend on imported materials and exported products. Global supply chains connect producers and consumers across continents. These connections create enormous efficiencies and enable unprecedented prosperity, just as they did in the Bronze Age. But they also create vulnerabilities that become apparent when the networks are disrupted. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a preview of how quickly global supply chains can break down when transportation systems are disrupted. Modern examples of Bronze Age-style vulnerabilities are everywhere. Computer chips are manufactured primarily in Taiwan and South Korea. Rare earth elements essential for modern electronics come mainly from China. Critical pharmaceutical ingredients are produced in India and China. When any of these supply chains is disrupted, the effects ripple through the entire global economy. Climate change poses threats similar to those that destabilized the Bronze Age world. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities that serve as crucial nodes in global trade networks. Changing precipitation patterns affect agricultural regions that feed billions of people. Extreme weather events disrupt transportation systems and damage critical infrastructure. The difference is that modern climate change is happening faster and on a larger scale than the Bronze Age climate crisis. We have better scientific understanding of what's happening, but we also have a much more complex and interdependent global system that could be disrupted by climate impacts. Political instability continues to threaten international cooperation just as it did in the Bronze Age. Trade wars disrupt economic networks. Regional conflicts threaten crucial supply routes. The breakdown of international agreements undermines the diplomatic systems that manage global cooperation. Perhaps most troubling, modern political systems show some of the same vulnerabilities to internal collapse that destroyed Bronze Age palaces. Growing inequality creates tensions between elite groups and common populations. Political polarization undermines the consensus needed for effective governance. Loss of institutional legitimacy weakens the foundations of democratic governance. But there are also crucial differences between the modern world and the Bronze Age that might help us avoid a similar collapse. Modern communication systems are far more robust and redundant than Bronze Age diplomatic networks. Scientific understanding gives us better tools for predicting and managing risks. Democratic institutions, despite their flaws, provide mechanisms for peaceful political change that didn't exist in Bronze Age palace systems. Modern technology also provides capabilities that Bronze Age civilizations lacked. Global monitoring systems can detect emerging crises before they become catastrophic. International organizations provide mechanisms for coordinating responses to transnational threats. Rapid transportation systems enable quick deployment of resources to affected areas. The key lessons from the Bronze Age collapse aren't about specific threats, but about how complex systems fail. The Bronze Age world collapsed not because of any single catastrophe, but because multiple stresses aligned to overwhelm the system's capacity to adapt. This suggests that preventing modern collapse requires managing multiple risks simultaneously rather than focusing on individual threats. Climate change, political instability, economic inequality, and technological disruption all need to be addressed as interconnected challenges rather than separate problems. The Bronze Age collapse also demonstrates the importance of redundancy and resilience in complex systems. The Bronze Age world was so interconnected that failures anywhere in the system could cascade everywhere. Modern systems need backup mechanisms and alternative pathways that can maintain essential functions when primary systems fail. Perhaps most importantly, the Bronze Age collapse shows how quickly things can change when multiple systems fail simultaneously. The transition from Bronze Age prosperity to Dark Age poverty happened within a few decades. Modern collapse, if it occurred, could happen even faster given the speed of modern communications and transportation. This doesn't mean that modern civilization is doomed to repeat the Bronze Age experience. But it does mean that we need to take seriously the risks that come with complexity and interconnection. The prosperity that global systems create also creates vulnerabilities that require active management. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that human progress isn't inevitable or irreversible. Civilizations can collapse. Knowledge can be lost. Progress can be reversed. But it also reminds us that humans are remarkably adaptable and resilient. Even after the catastrophic collapse of the Bronze Age world, civilization eventually recovered and achieved even greater heights. The question for our modern world isn't whether we face risks similar to those that brought down Bronze Age civilization. We clearly do. The question is whether we'll learn from their experience and build systems robust enough to survive the inevitable crises that lie ahead. The Bronze Age collapse was humanity's first global catastrophe. With proper planning and preparation, it doesn't have to be a preview of our own future, but only if we're wise enough to learn from the past and plan for an uncertain future. The Bronze Age world thought it would last forever. It lasted 50 years after the first signs of trouble appeared. In our interconnected modern world, we might not have even that much time to adapt when the next great crisis begins. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't that complex civilizations are doomed to fail. It's that they require wisdom, planning, and constant vigilance to survive. The price of civilization is eternal preparedness for the forces that would destroy it. The Bronze Age collapse ended the ancient world's first global civilization. Whether we create the last one depends on how well we learn from their mistakes.